r/AslReddit. How have you seen a person's life be ruined in a single day? Like 7-ish years ago, a bunch of the crew chiefs at my guard base were out celebrating one of their own who got his associate's degree. They were all drinking, not a ton, and eventually went home. Except for one guy. He stayed and drank until last call. He decided to drive home. He hit a 20-year-old who was on his way to work at about 2 AM and turned him into a paraplegic. Our wing commander basically told him, plead guilty to the county and go to jail with an administrative discharge. His family would have been able to keep some of his benefits, like the Valone and GI Bill, or fight it, lose, cost his family tons of money, and get a dishonorable. Dishonorable basically is like you never even served. He plead guilty. Edit. Dishonorable like you never served in regards to benefits. Any bonuses you received you have to pay back. Medals are rescinded. It is also listed on job applications, and people will deny you because of it. I know a dishonorable is like a felony, but to do it is a long process, regardless if he got convicted in civilian criminal court. His discharge was a hey, you still have 2 years left in your contract before re-enlistment, so you're just going to resign that right now instead. Also, to the people who think that he got away scot-free, he didn't. He went to jail. Felony DUI and assault with a deadly weapon or something like that. The wing commander only allowed him to do at least one selfless thing and still be able to transfer his GI Bill and Valone to his family. He also had to pay medical expenses for the kid he hit, and probably other damages as well, so it's not like he got a free pass on that. 3 weeks after graduating from high school, a student got drunk at a party and put a knife in another guy's chest. Didn't kill him, but it was a close call. Goodbye adulthood. I've got a related one. I was in the Navy. One of my guys who was a third-class petty officer got into an argument with a chief he was working with in a shitty temporary job. Nobody knows the full story because they were the only 2 people there, but they both had knives and the chief stabbed him in the gut. I knew them both very well, and I'm sure the kid was at fault, but he got a medical discharge and the chief got completely fucked after 17 years of service. I don't know what chief's actual fate was, but I know he was charged, and the other guy wasn't. They were both what I would consider to be good people, but the kid definitely had a chip on his shoulder and the chief seemed like a totally boring, but nice individual with a wife and kids and whatnot. Not a grumpy or hated guy like many others. Edit. Stabbed guy was fine after surgery. It's been 11 years or so, and he's still posting on Facebook. I liked him too, but he was cocky and young. I was a surgical intern, and there was a 4th year med student, just 1 year behind me, on our general surgery team as an acting intern. Dude was an all-American in every sense, extremely bright, tall and good looking, charming to talk to, class president, etc. He was literally like Captain America Steve Rogers incarnate. Wanted to be a general surgeon at my hospital, and all of my attending physicians were extremely fond of him. They already were talking about how great of a resident he would make, and what to do when he was an intern. It was nearing the end of his rotation, and he was scheduled to do a routine surgery with the chair of the department, specifically so the chair could evaluate him and give him a letter of recommendation afterwards. The evening before his big day, he and I went over the steps of the procedure and the little quirks that the chair liked, so he could impress the chair for a good letter. He left and we texted about some additional tiny details about the surgery later. Next morning, my chief tells me I need to scrub him for the surgery that the student was supposed to do because he hadn't showed up yet. I told a 3rd year medical student who was also on our team to go look for him because it wasn't like him to be late. This guy was militantly punctual. It was odd he'd be late on a day like this. About an hour into the surgery, my chief resident comes in and asks me to scrub out and informs me that the student I had sent earlier had found him in his apartment in a pool of his own blood, shot through the neck. None of his possessions were missing, and he had no clear enemies or reasons that someone might want him dead. Someone just broke in and shot him. I had trouble believing it. It was very bizarre and surreal. I was later questioned by a detective, because I was technically the last person to communicate with him via text. A few months later they eventually caught the kids responsible a few states away. Apparently it was some sort of gang initiation to kill a random person, and they got their due. But the whole ordeal left me in a funk for a while, because it was so completely random and senseless, and that kid had literally everything going for him. He was one of the really good ones. I grew up best friends with my sister, and one day she didn't come home from work. I was 16 at the time. She was 22. I heard my parents start to rumble around the house turning the lights on, and I could hear more commotion and panic. The cops had called our house cause they found my sister's car damaged on a street in the middle of a neighborhood with the driver's side door still open, and they found one of her shoes was in the middle of the street the next morning. Still no sister. She worked as a bartender. She left work that night and some guy followed her, sideswiped her car, and when she got out to swap insurance he kidnapped her and put her in his truck and drove off, and that night continued to rape and abuse her and held her captive through the night and into the next day. My sister managed to escape that next day and run to the nearest house, banging on the doors. The homeowners let my sister in and called 911. They could tell she had been beaten and attacked. She was taken to the hospital, which is when we got the phone call where she was. She had 2 broken ribs. Her face was nearly black and blue, both black eyes, and scratches all over her body. After that I've never had my sister back. She survived the attack, but she suffers horrible anxiety and panic attacks. She can't go out in public alone. She drinks heavily and is terrified to move out of my mom's and live alone. IDK. I just used to look up to her, and we would laugh and watch movies and bounce on the trampoline, and she would drive me to try local food chains and we would listen to music, and ever since I've never had my big sister back. I'll always love her, but it breaks my heart. In one day her life changed for the worst. Yup, and I did it. Boss hadn't produced kiddie porn. It disturbed me so much I spoke with a friend who was a desk sergeant the town over and asked what could be done. He passed word along to the chief of the town where it was happening. 2 days later the biggest cop I've ever seen walked through the door of our shop and asked to see everyone's it. Cuffed and stuffed. You should have seen his face when I was summoned to testify at the grand jury hearing. Edit. This whole thing has been sort of cleansing for me. I've never spoken about it to anyone other than my wife, who supported my decision to become a jobless college student with a family and mortgage. Thanks for the honest and kind words. The most important edit. Those of you saying I'm a hero. I'm not, I'm just a person. The real heroes in this thread are the ones that lived through situations like this and continued on. Maybe reach out to some of them and ask if they're okay. Let them know that they are important, respected, and most of all a valued member of our community. I keep getting asked how I found out, and I've answered it on a few occasions and got a bit rude to one individual. Apologies. I was approached by the victim and they asked for help. I helped. Edited to clarify and reply. Of course I'm there 100% for her. She's been in my life for over 20 years, and we've seen each other through the best and worst of situations. But how am I supposed to prevent her from reaching her breaking point when she's literally lost the most important thing that she's ever known? Nobody can understand the utter devastation of watching your own child die because of a senseless act of violence unless they've experienced it. Asterisk 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 he was not involved with gangs in any way. This was not a targeted attack. It was not retaliation. He was not in possession of a weapon. There was no confrontation. He was merely sitting in the front seat of the car, his longtime girlfriend driving. She too is a fragile, sweet soul who had her life destroyed in the blink of an eye. Asterisk 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 he was a registered organ donor, and due to his absolute love of animals and people, was always a kind, giving kid. His mother instilled a great many beautiful attributes as she raised him, and his gift of precious organs has given the hope of a future to so many families. Appreciate the words of support and comfort, both in replies and private message. Thank you. On April 2nd, this year, my best friend's son went to run a quick errand. Told her be back soon. An hour later, she's wearing just her pajamas next to a hospital entrance, being told they cannot allow her inside due to a shooting victim's admittance and the subsequent mandated lockdown. Her son, the boy I knew from the moment he was born 19 years prior, was brain dead and on life support. He became an organ donor 5 days later. Didn't take even a minute, let alone a day, for her to lose her entire reason for breathing. She's ruined. And I'm dreading the moment she decides there's no point in going on. Because barring a miracle, it's inevitable. Caused it, and was happy to do it. I was an captain in the army at the time. One of my soldiers, a senior E4 looking to make sergeant, had just gone through a rough divorce, his first to second. Anyway, he has made Darth Vader's theme song / march song the ringtone on his phone for when she called. He was outside having a smoke, and I was walking by his desk when she called. I smiled at the humor of it, and looked down, instantly losing my smile because, as his phone rang with the ringtone for his now ex, the screen showed a picture of her daughter, his stepdaughter, about 6 years old, asleep, and naked. She was not sending the picture, it was what he had attached to come up when she called. I instantly sent 2 of my sergeants to sit with him and keep him at the smoking bench, but to say nothing, while I had my company first sergeant call CID, Central Investigations Division, to send me a detective. Long story short, detective seized his phone, home computer and office computer. Found that since the divorce he had been living off post / base with a 16-year-old girlfriend and had been trafficking kiddie porn of his ex-stepdaughter that her mother knew nothing about. Between the evidence and my testimony, he was sentenced to 25 to 55 years in federal prison for peddling child porn as well as statutory rape of his new girlfriend. When I was 7, my father came home from work and told my mother he wanted a divorce. He grabbed a suitcase and packed some things while my mother alternated between crying, trying to cook dinner for me and my brother, and screaming at him that he was insane. She had no idea where this was coming from, and she would change the locks if he left. He did leave, and she did indeed change the locks the very next day. She went from a homemaker to a single mother the next day, and our standing of living fell immensely. I don't think she ever recovered from the stress of the divorce and trying to raise us on her own. Thinking about what a kind, smart, and wonderful person my mother is, and how my father basically ruined her life when she was only 32 makes me really sad. She just wanted to have kids and then go back to work when we were both in grade school so she could be a teacher like she wanted to, but the divorce killed that dream. We became latchkey kids in a bad neighborhood while she had to work in call centers or in hotel housekeeping because being a teacher didn't pay enough or give her enough time off to take care of us. I became a surrogate mother for my baby brother when my mother worked long hours. It was a culture shock, to say the least. I remember going to therapy, which I now know was court ordered because my mom wanted to have sole custody, so she had to have us evaluated to prove that my dad wasn't up to task of sharing custody throughout the divorce proceedings, and counselors telling me over and over that it was going to be okay, that my parents still loved us, and we'd still go to the same school and have the same life we would have. I didn't believe them at the time, and I was right to. Our lives derailed entirely that single day. I'm okay, so is my brother. But my mother gave all of her health and the best years of her life to raising us in thankless circumstances, while my father failed to pay child support and came around only enough to avoid a bench warrant or to prevent my mom from gaining sole custody and increasing his support obligations. It makes me bitter to see him happy now and my mother in poor health when she's 2 decades too young to have the health problems of an 80-year-old. Related, my grandmother became our second mother in the wake of the divorce. The stress of that killed her as well. You can track pictures of her from about 55, when my parents got divorced, and how young and beautiful she was. Then you look at pictures of her in her 60s, and she looks haggard. She died of cancer in her early 70s. I blocked out the memories of those early days for a long time. I've only recently done the heavy lifting of trying to dig up the emotions and events of my life from age 7 to about 14. I honestly remember little to nothing. Traumatic memory is wild. Pursuant to my goal of trying to support my mom. Partially because she deserves it. Partially because I don't want her to meet the same fate as my grandmother. It's weird to think about how I wouldn't be on the hook for my mom's failing health now. I could have had a happier childhood, and my mom could have had a better life, and my grandmother might not be dead had my dad just decided not to be a miserable fucking asshole that day and all the days thereafter. Did your dad ever give you any explanation? In broken conversations through the years, I have contact with him. It works, so long as I don't think about the past and don't mention my mom. He maintains that she thought of him like a bottomless wallet and was controlling and abusive. His contentions are absurd. I've been close to my mother my entire life and know all her flaws. She can be passive aggressive, manipulative, and prone to giving you guilt trips. But she's also endlessly self-sacrificial. I've met very few people on this planet with that ability to just give and give and give. Her family did everything for my dad, who was poor, when he met her, and he just used her and discarded her like old rubbish when it turned out that having 2 kids meant that the honeymoon phase was over. It's also projection. When my mother had a nervous breakdown, post-divorce court battle, dad lied to get his child support reduced. I lived with my father for 3 years. Life at my mother's home was full of pinching pennies, but she never made me feel worthless. That was always my father's way. He was always a classic control freak and emotionally abusive. I didn't stand a chance. No matter how good the school I was going to was, or how much more money my father had than my mother, I always felt like an invader or inmate in his house. I'm not really interested in hearing more about why he did what he did that day and all the years thereafter. The games with child support and alimony, for instance. When I was younger, I didn't understand it. I've now passed the age where he did what he did, and I still do not understand how someone can be so selfish and amoral. If I confronted him, he'd give me an excuse. Maybe he'd even give me an apology. But I don't want it. It's not genuine if he's giving it just to make me stop being mad at him. If he offers it himself, unprompted, because he knew what he did was wrong, maybe I'd accept it. But not otherwise. He's the reason I don't have kids and don't want them. If you're a good person, they'll chain you down and rob you of vitality. I did that to my mom because she lost the support of a life partner. It's just what kids do. I wasn't a bad kid, but it's hard out there for a single parent. I don't want that for myself. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to give my mom the retirement she deserves, to make up for the decades that my father took from her out of hate, to make up for the decades I took from out of love her when my father wasn't there to share the burden. During my final high school exam for English, I remember I was sitting next to this popular kid. Because we were seated alphabetically, I always sat next to him during exams. There's a well-known Canadian university in my city that everyone wanted to get into, and at the time the entrance average for business and science was 82%. If you managed to get 82% in your core subjects, you were admitted. They no longer do this sort of admission guarantee in recent years. It's been more and more competitive each year. Anyway, this guy I was sitting next to was telling me that he was really ready for this exam, and he was going to write his essay on the one movie we watched in class. We were supposed to prepare multiple texts just in case the essay question on the exam didn't lend itself well to one particular text. I don't quite remember the question, but I know it didn't lend itself quite well to the movie, but rather more so to a book we read in class. I finished my exam before him, and when we were allowed to talk, I asked him how it went. He looked dazed, and he told me that he knew he failed. He needed to do well on this exam to get into any university, let alone the well-known one. I'm graduating next week, computer science, woo, and I met this guy again while looking for a new dress shirt for graduation. He worked at the suit shop. I asked him if he was graduating soon, and he told me that after high school he went to upgrade his high school courses so he could reapply to universities. He was saying that every year they increased the entrance averages and he couldn't meet them after upgrading, so he went to upgrade again. He repeated this process 4 times and finally got in for 2020. It's dumb that how well you do as a teenager can determine the next 5 years of your life. From a police friend of mine in another state, pulled up on this to support another officer. Apparently a guy was pulled over after swerving and making a lane change without indicating. I think they figured he was just on his phone or something. Routine traffic stop. That would probably have just been a warning. Pull up and notice 2 kids in the backseat, and the officer immediately smells liquor, pulls him out, does all the tests, and the guy seems okay at first, but guy blows something really high. He later admitted to having an open container in the back that he was drinking in the parking lot he had just left while waiting for his kids to get out of their daycare. Later found out he discovered his wife had been cheating on him and drained a bank account on the way to get said kids. His house was like 2 miles from the Childka place, so he had just recently been drinking. Since he had kids in the car, he was charged with multiple counts of felony child endangerment or something. Each charge applied to each child in the car. The extreme DUI, but he also had a loaded firearm in the car. I don't remember if the firearm made the DUI a more severe one, but I do remember my police officer friend telling me that there was a specific charge with having the firearm within reach while having an open container. My friend pulls up to help, and this guy's going ballistic. Plus at this point the booze he had just been chugging is probably hitting him full strength, so he gets irate and tried to headbutt then bite the officer that had him detained. My friend takes him down, which apparently aggravated an old back injury this guy had. More on this later. So on top of the other stuff he was getting charged with, he's now got another felony for assaulting a law enforcement officer. Guy had 0 criminal history before this, not even so much as a traffic ticket. My friend ended up checking back up on the guy from time to time, as after they got him under control and secured while EMS came, is when he started bawling in tears and spills the info about his wife, and that's why he was drinking. He said most of the charges ended up sticking, and he got multiple years in prison. Biggest ones were the child endangerment ones. Now obviously this is later on, but my police officer friend found out through the grapevine that he lost all custody of his children and had to have multiple surgeries / medical procedures while in prison for his back. Fast forward years later, I want to say like 3 or 4 years, and my friend arrests this same guy for riding a bike without lights. He had a bunch of heroin on him. As he was running him through, he recognized the name and put 2 and 2 together when he saw the guy's priors. While he was driving him to jail, the guy said he got hooked on pain medication because of his back injury upon being released, but doctors would no longer prescribe him pills, so he went to heroin. Friend kind of felt bad that he might have caused it all, but told me the guy was pretty down to earth about it and said it wasn't his fault. He deserved everything he got. Pretty sure he's still in prison, as I'm sure the drug charge violated some sort of probation. This is minor compared to some stories in this thread, but at the time, it was terribly traumatic. When I was 14, I got back from a church trip just as service was letting out on Sunday. My parents weren't there for service or to pick me up, and people kept coming up to ask me how my sister was. In the South, chit-chat is common. I didn't immediately realize something had happened. Someone finally realized I didn't know anything about what happened, and the youth pastor called my parents. My sister, a state trooper, had been directing traffic on the freeway the night before, and a truck had hit her while traveling 55 miles/hour. She was in hospital. My parents were there with her, and no one knew what the prognosis was. The youth pastor dropped me off at home, and I wasn't even in the door before my younger brother and sister were rushing to tell me that my sister was getting a divorce. At the time, given our religious upbringing, that almost seemed worse than being injured. I'd reached incomprehension by that point. My parents didn't get back to the house until the next day, and I spent it in hell, not knowing how badly my sister was hurt. Her life was basically ruined in an instant. Recovery took a long time, such that she lost her job. Her husband, during her recovery, was revealed to be both an asshole and addicted to gambling. He'd gambled away $50,000 that they didn't have. They divorced before she was able to walk unassisted. Having said that, she's doing much better now. Her health recovered almost completely, save for some memory problems due to the concussion. She went back to school and built a new career for herself. Everything didn't happen in a single day, but my life fell apart on July 11th, 2015 when my 19-year-old daughter and only child was killed in a car accident. Life had already been rough when I was diagnosed with 2 types of cancer in 2010. Then my job of almost 10 years closed, and I was laid off in 2011. And my relationship of 9 years ended in 2014. The week after she died I started medicating myself more and more with opiates until this last January when I overdosed on heroin/fentanyl and nearly died, being brought back with nasal Narcan after 3 failed attempts with liquid/injected Narcan. I survived only because a friend performed CPR on me, keeping oxygen going to my brain, while others scrambled around looking for nasal somewhere in my house. It was in the fridge. Unrelated to my overdose, I only just checked out of a mental rehabilitation center for severe stress and suicidal thoughts at noon today. I'd been under medical supervision since last week Wednesday and made enough progress to be checked out this afternoon. Until now I'd spent the last week in an empty room with no TV or radio, no shoes with shoelaces, no belts, drawstrings, no writing utensils beyond a tiny 2-inch golf pencil, and 3 frequently boring and nearly salt deficient meals a day served directly to my room with no eating utensils outside of a scoop made from the edges of a paper cup. Honestly, my life ended the moment my daughter died on a slightly curving highway in Iowa. Love your children while you can. Love your family and friends. Everyone who means anything to you right now. It can all be taken away in a single second, I swear. Can I do a span of a couple years? Last day of 2nd grade I get up excited for school because we were all supposed to go see a movie as a class. I walk outside and see my older brother hang himself from the swing set. I just stood there and stared. My uncle comes out and sees it and yells for everyone adult wise and shoved me back inside. My grandma locks and barricades me in the bathroom while everyone else was frantically trying to save my brother, who had used barbed wire as a noose. A long time later I'm let out and my mom is hysterical and I have no idea what was happening. Didn't really sink in until I went to his funeral. Fast forward about 10 to 11 months and my grandpa dies from liver disease among other problems. Fast forward about 6 to 7 months. I'm sleeping when my dad gets a call from his brother in the middle of the night. My brother had been out drinking with his friends and he drove home drunk in his Jeep along the Tamiami Trail. He lost control and was partially ejected. His legs were caught on the roll cage as it rolled multiple times. A passerby sometime later called 911 when they got to a phone, pre-cell phone eater. My uncle is dispatched as he was the helicopter pilot for the sheriff's deputy and was logically the fastest officer to send. Upon arriving and turning his searchlight on, he recognized my brother's baby blue Jeep all mangled. He landed and ran to help my brother, but he was already clearly dead. After medics and other deputies arrived he flew back to base and called my dad, who then told my mom and then woke me and my sister up and told us what happened. I spent years in therapy and was a very quiet kid who stayed to himself. Eventually when my school therapist got me talking, he got me to tell my story to my classmates and the teachers were officially informed of why I was the way I was. That was 20 plus years ago. Nowadays I'm not really bothered by death and it's one of the reasons why I got into Len and recently EMT. I want to try and stop what happened to me from happening to someone else or at least help them through the difficulty of it. My ultimate end game would to be on the DWI task enforcement team here. Thank you so much for watching the whole video. Please leave a like and subscribe.